The Texas State Senate has passed a sweeping elections bill. In part, it would limit early voting hours, make drive-through voting illegal, and restrict voting by mail. Texas Democrats claim the legislation is intended to keep their supporters away from the polls. Senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe reports.
The Texas bill is still up for consideration in the state House, but Democrats say it targets some of the Lone Star State's most Democratic areas, like Harris County, encompassing Houston, where more than 100,000 cast drive-through ballots last year during the pandemic. Critics also say it would make it harder for minority voters to cast ballots.
Say it is, part of this pattern that we're seeing across the country of bills that would make it harder to vote and suppress the vote.
About 55 more restrictive voting proposals are up for serious consideration in 24 states. 5 have been signed into law, including the new law in Georgia passed last week. While some states expanded voting options due to COVID, CBS News election law expert David Becker says proposals like the one in Texas go far beyond returning to pre-pandemic levels.
The provisions in the Texas law are actually making Texas even worse than they were before the pandemic. It is making it harder for people to vote by mail. One of the most restrictive states, if not the most restrictive states for mail voting in the country.
Corporate opposition to the Republican proposals is growing. American Airlines, a major Texas employer, says it's strongly opposed to the Texas bill because it will limit voting access. Meanwhile, President Biden says he supports calls from some Major League Baseball players to move this summer's All-Star game out of Atlanta because of Georgia's new voting law.
This is Jim Crow on steroids, what they're doing in Georgia and 40 other states.
Georgia Republican Governor Brian Kemp struck back.
I think the people are standing up and realizing the games that are being played here, and they're going to be fighting back with us.
The Georgia law includes new restrictions on voting by mail, limits where ballot drop boxes can be placed and when they can be accessed, and gives the state legislature greater control over how elections are run.
So Ed is joining us now from the White House. Ed, there is growing backlash to this new Georgia law on a variety of fronts. Who's leading the charge?
Yeah, well, the most interesting development is there are now religious leaders based in Georgia and other states saying they want to begin a national boycott next week of Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, and Home Depot, 3 of the Atlanta area's largest employers. Coca-Cola and Delta have issued statements in opposition to the voting rights law that was passed and signed last week in Georgia. But these religious leaders say the companies should be doing and saying more, should be speaking out against the laws that are up for consideration in those other states as well, and that they'll continue to put pressure on them and possibly other major companies across the South if they don't start using their clout and their positions as major corporate, major companies to speak out. And that's why we've seen, for example, the Delta CEO, he was on CBS this morning yesterday discussing this, admitting the company that they probably should have been speaking out a little sooner, and they're facing criticism from Republican lawmakers in Georgia for only getting on the bandwagon now, they say.
And what about this Texas bill? Critics say it's going to make it harder for minorities to vote. How would it do that?
Well, here's the thing. Harris County, Texas, for example, what is very soon going to be the 3rd largest metropolitan area in the country, set up a few different facilities in the county over the course of the fall to allow drive-in voting. Hundreds of thousands, well, a little more than 100,000 people came in, voted, rolled down the window, cast their ballot, got out of the way. And it, increased access, increased participation, but civil rights leaders, others who've been monitoring things there and in other parts of the state say the expansion that was put in place did nothing to suggest fraud, malfeasance of any kind. If anything, it just boosted participation. So why on earth would Republican legislators want to make these changes if, other than the expanded access may have led to greater participation, which is going to lead to more people potentially voting against them? It's very similar to what you saw in Georgia. The other difference is, restricting mail-in voting. As David Becker said in our report there, and he would know, Texas has some of the most restricted vote-by-mail laws in the country, and there's concern that by making even more changes, it's going to make it more difficult. It's a large state, geographically diverse, ethnically, racially diverse, and look, Democrats didn't win again in this past cycle. They are confident they can make some gains next year and in 2024, and they know that as long as Republican legislators control the rules, the rules of the road in terms of voting in Texas, that they could continue to try to tweak things to their advantage.
So Democrats want to pass H.R. 1, which is also known as the For the People Act. It would expand voting rights. Would the passage of H.R. 1 curb these Republican initiatives like the ones that we're seeing in Texas and Georgia?
Yeah, not necessarily all of them, but certainly it would be putting in place national mandates in terms of early voting options, automatic voter registration, public financing of some elections, and other changes that are designed to expand access. Democrats say. Republicans turn around and say, look, local elections should be administered and overseen by local officials, not from Washington. But of course, Democrats could turn around and say, well, what you're doing at the state level is trying to control county elections. So how is what you're doing that much different than what we're trying to doing at the federal level? Look, this is all about partisan politics. You're going to see some pretty competitive races in a lot of these big states where the most high-profile, most contentious debates over this are ongoing. Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, all four of them saw gains by Democrats. All four are controlled by Republicans. They're doing this in part with the urging of former President Trump and his supporters, who have misfounded, unproven beliefs that the election was stolen from him last fall. And the debate continues in places like Wisconsin and Michigan, New Hampshire, where there is Republican legislative control at least, and where they're going to try to push some of these through as well. And we got to remember with the Georgia law, because, and we talked about this last week when it passed, we had talked about it when we were down there with some of the officials that were part of the negotiations. What ended up getting put into the Georgia law was far less extreme or controversial, perhaps, than what had been initially proposed. And that's important to remember in all of these states. There have been some proposals. Some would call them draconian, extreme, unnecessary. Look at the final piece of legislation once it passes and see that in Georgia, for example, on a statewide basis, early voting was expanded to every state. Asking for one's driver's license number or their social security number instead of a signature, election law experts like our David Becker would tell you, is actually a cleaner, more organized way to track identification on a ballot than talking about one's signature that may have changed over the last few years. So some of these changes ultimately may prove to be something that helps make elections more organized and less disputed. Other things like restricting who can talk to somebody waiting in a long line, or restricting drive-through voting or mail-in voting, those are things that certainly are up for debate and definitely going to be up for legal challenge.
Yeah, precisely. Especially when you think of what we saw during the last election. In some areas were mighty long lines to vote, people standing outside in hot weather for hours. And so, a bottle of water would go a long way.
Right. Or figure out a way to make sure the line's shorter, Well,
there's always that.
Right.
All right, so true. You're so spot on. Ed, thank you.
Take care.